Okay, hi everyone. We're just going to have a couple of minutes while everyone arrives and then we'll start properly. So make yourselves comfortable. I can see lots of people arriving now. Feel free if you want to say hi in the chat at the bottom of your screen, go for it, put hi, put where you're from if you want to, just the county if you're in the UK or the country if you're not. Okay, a few of you putting hi, that's great. Hi everyone. We'll give it just a couple more minutes before we start properly. I hope everyone's having a good day. Hi, loads of people putting hi in the chat. Say hi. That's great. Oh, someone from the Netherlands. Welcome. Oh, someone in tier 4. Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope your Christmas hasn't been too disrupted. Okay, just a few more seconds and then I think we'll start properly. If you've just joined, welcome everyone. We're putting a quick hi message in the chat, just saying hello, where we're from, if you want to. And we're just waiting for a couple more to come in and then we're going to start properly. Oh, welcome from Chile, from Ireland, lots of you in London. Hello from Singapore there as well, that's amazing. Fantastic. Okay, all right, let's get started. So welcome everyone, welcome to the MyTutor Christmas holiday course in GCSE biology. Today we're going to be looking at the endocrine system and control of insulin, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I was lucky enough to tutor the MyTutor online school through the first lockdown and also some of the half-term course this year as well. So some of you might have come across me before, but my name's Charlotte. I studied conservation and biodiversity at the University of Exeter for my master's degree, and I currently work as a farm conservation advisor as well. So I was lucky enough to take my biology through to my job. So let's go through to what we're looking at today. Let's head into the lesson space. So this week, so that's today, tomorrow and Wednesday, the 23rd, we're going to be looking at a little part of the homeostasis part of the biology GCSE syllabus. So hopefully this is something that you've come across already. If you haven't, this is a really good introduction to it. So don't worry, whatever stage you're at, this is a good place to be. So today we're going to look at hormonal control. And then we're going to follow that with a kind of case study as to how hormones can be involved in homeostasis. So we're going to look at how 2 hormones are involved in regulating the amount of glucose in our blood. And then finally, we're going to have a quick look at plant hormones and hopefully have a bit of a Christmas quiz. So we've based this on AQA GCSE biology, but this is a very general topic. It comes up in all of the specifications, certainly in the UK, so it should be relevant to all of you. As far as housekeeping goes, I will stop a couple of times for questions and answers. If you've got any questions or answers, pop them in the Q&A. And then I'll also stop occasionally for your opinion or to ask you some past paper questions as well at the end, so we can work on exam technique. And for that, pop your answers in the chat, and that just keeps kind of all the questions in one place and all of the kind of chat in the others, and stops me having to scroll as far. Also, I have done a undergraduate degree and a master's degree, so if you have questions about university, feel free to pop those in as well. And exam technique, we'll kind of try and cover a little bit of exam technique on all 3 days as well, so lots to get through and lots to look forward to, and I hope it's useful for your GCSEs. Okay, so let's get started. So today is all about the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a way for our body to coordinate are responses within the body. So you might be a bit more familiar with the nervous system, which is something else that you kind of study as part of the homeostasis topic. And the nervous system and the endocrine system are both ways of getting messages around your body, controlling reactions, making sure that you can respond to changes in your environment. And that's what homeostasis is all about in general. It's about maintaining internal conditions. So whether that's maintaining an internal temperature, maintaining blood glucose levels, that's what we're going to talk about today, maintaining water content, it's all done through these messengers that run around our body and make sure that we keep everything in the right place and at the right level. And I often find when I'm tutoring students privately that the endocrine system is slightly more difficult to kind of get your head around than the nervous system. So I thought it would be a good thing to investigate over the next few days. So as we've said at the top of the slide, the endocrine system is like the nervous system in that it coordinates and controls reactions in your body. So glands from our body secrete hormones, which generally have slower and more lasting effects than actions generated by the nervous system. So a gland is a bit like a muscle, it's an area of your body, but a gland is specifically there to secrete a hormone, and a hormone is a chemical messenger that moves around our body in the blood. And so it's slightly unlike the nervous system, which has nervous responses through the different types of nerve. Hormones traveling through the blood are slightly slower. Some are more fast acting than others, but they tend to be a slightly lower, but in turn they have a more lasting effect than actions generated by the nervous system. So we're looking more at the long term here. And I've included a little diagram here, which you often again see when you talk about the nervous system, where we say that a stimulus, which is a change that occurs in the environment, and that stimulus, that change, is picked up by receptors in the body. Those receptors then send a message to the control center, which is normally our brain. And that control center goes, oh, I see this change. I've got the message. I'm going to send another message out now to tell the effectors what to do. So another message goes out, that's this blue arrow here. And then the effectors, which are muscles or glands, generate a response. Now for muscles, that's movement. So that's using your nerves to move that muscle. But for hormones in the endocrine system, it's the glands that are in control. So the glands secrete chemicals called hormones into the blood. The blood, which travels all around our body, so it's quite a convenient mode of transport, carries the hormone to its target organ. And the target organ has receptors on cell membranes that pick up the hormone molecules. So they have a complementary shape. If you talked about enzymes, it's very similar. So the target organ will have receptor cells that have a complementary shape to the hormone molecules. And that triggers a response. And that response differs depending on the hormone that's been released. Okay. So, taking that on, this slide has zoomed in a bit. Let me zoom one out for you. There we go, that looks a bit better. Lots and lots of words on this slide. Don't worry, we're going to be here for a while. If you're taking notes, you don't necessarily need them in this much detail, but this is the best way that I can find to make sure that you guys understand how all of the different glands and hormones fit together. I'm going to make that a little bit smaller again. It's just getting a bit stuck, isn't it? Let's try 85%. We'll move it up and down a bit if we need to. Okay, so I wanted us to get a good idea about where the main glands are in the body, and you'll need to know where these glands are and the names of them, and you'll need to know the hormones that they produce. Now, in the next 3 days, we're going to look particularly this hormone here, insulin, but other parts of the syllabus cover particularly FSH, TSH, LH, and estrogen and testosterone as well as part of the menstrual cycle. And the others come up as well. So don't worry if you don't memorize all of these today, they will come up again. So let's start at the top here with the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is found in our brain. It's very small and it's a master gland. So as well as secreting hormones directly, it's called the master gland because it also sends out hormones that act as messengers to other glands to secrete other hormones again. So it's kind of like the central nervous system if you're talking about the nervous system rather than the endocrine system. So the pituitary gland is pretty cool. You can see it there. Let's put the pen up and then I can draw all over this. So this is the first one we're going to talk about in the brain here. So for the hormones that it secretes that have a direct effect on the body, it secretes a hormone called ADH that you'll come across when we talk about water in the kidneys. That's another part of the syllabus. And ADH affects the amount of urine produced in the kidney. So that's to do with controlling the water that's leaving our bodies. It also secretes growth hormone, which affects the growth rate in children. So those are two hormones that the pituitary gland secretes and have a direct effect on the body. Then if we just scroll down slightly, the pituitary gland also secretes hormones that cause other endocrine glands to release hormones in turn. So it's like it's sending a messenger saying this needs to be done to other glands. Those are the follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, which you'll have heard about if you've talked about the menstrual cycle in other parts of the syllabus. If you haven't, it will come up. And FSH stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen, which is the female sex hormone. So FSH is very involved in female reproduction. It also sends out TSH, and TSH travels from the pituitary gland to the thyroid gland, which the sharp-eyed among you will have noticed is over here. And TSH makes sure that the thyroid gland produces thyroxine. And thyroxine controls metabolism rate. So how quickly we process what we eat is our metabolism rate. And then finally, there's luteinizing hormone at the bottom here, which I think my slide has cut out. So that's a bit irritating. Let's see if I can pull that one up over here. No, I don't think I'm going to get that through. But luteinizing hormone stimulates the testes to produce testosterone. So it's kind of the equivalent of FSH in that the pituitary gland says, hey, we need to send out some of these female and male sex hormones, depending on which one is needed. So it sends out FSH if it's targeting the ovaries, or LH if it's targeting the testes. Okay, so that's the pituitary gland, that's the master gland. So if you need to, there'll be some questions that come up in an exam that say, name a gland that produces hormones, and the pituitary gland is a really good one to remember for that. So let's move down the body now to the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is in the throat, or in the throat area. And we've kind of talked about what happens from the thyroid gland. So when the pituitary gland sends out TSH, which we talked about down here, the thyroid gland sends out thyroxine. So thyroxine is the hormone here. All the hormones here I've put it in bold. And thyroxine travels in the blood and controls the metabolic rate of the body. And by metabolic rate, we mean how fast we process the molecules in the things that we eat. Then there's the adrenal gland, which we can see here. And the adrenal gland is quite easy to remember because the adrenal gland produces adrenaline. So they're spelled very similarly. So the adrenal gland produces adrenaline, which prepares the body for stressful situations, fight or flight response. And adrenaline is one of those hormones that's quite quick acting. So we see something and we have that very instinctive response, don't we? Particularly if we're afraid. For me, it's spiders. I get a real adrenaline rush when I see a spider because my body's saying you need to flee. You need lots of energy very quickly. And it's adrenaline that travels around my body and stimulates that response. Next, we have the pancreas. And the pancreas secretes the star hormone for this week, which is insulin. Insulin is a hormone that controls the levels of glucose in the blood, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the next few slides. And then finally, moving down the body again, we have the ovaries in the female body, and the testes in the male. So in the female body, the ovaries secrete estrogen, which is the female sex hormone. And estrogen controls the development of female secondary sexual characteristics, i.e. what goes on in female bodies in puberty, and is also involved in the menstrual cycle as well. Testosterone is released from the testes, and testosterone is the male sex hormone, and that controls the development of male secondary sexual characteristic, i.e. what happens to male bodies in puberty, and is also involved in sperm production as well. So both of those are essential for reproduction. Now, I appreciate that's quite a kind of very quick introduction to the endocrine system. So let's have a break for questions, and I'll leave that slide up because I know some of you will still be taking notes. So if I have a scroll down the Q&A, I think I've answered most of those first ones. Do I prefer the ecology or physiological aspects of biology? That's an interesting question. I am primarily an ecologist, but you quite often find when you're doing ecology that the reasons behind some of the behaviors and the things that you're seeing are due to physiology. So it all kind of interlinks in the end. Is this for triple or combined science? This topic comes up in both. And there may be some extra details depending on what syllabus you're using, what exam board you're using, but this topic in general does come up throughout. Yes, this lesson will be recorded. I did mean to mention that at the start. So this lesson will be recorded and it will be on YouTube. So you will be able to go back and look over it as well. Another good question, what does TSH stand for? TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Good question about insulin and diabetes. That will be answered later on. Hold fire, Joey. We'll get to that. Why did we mention secondary sexual characteristics and not primary? So primary sexual characteristics are those that are already there, whereas secondary sexual characteristics are those that develop during puberty. The pancreas gland produces insulin, Michelle. Hope I've got that right on here. Yes, here we go. The arrow from the pancreas to insulin there. And my LH, sorry, Lois, LH has been cut off. So that should say down there, I'll put a little text box down here. It should say stimulates the testes to produce testosterone. Oh, except I've spelled stimulates wrong there. there we go. If anyone needed that extra note there. Another question here, what does secrete mean? Secrete means to give out as such. How long does it take to do a postgraduate and undergraduate degree together? In the UK, that takes, it depends on what type of postgraduate degree you do, but if you want to do an undergraduate degree and a master's, it can take anything between 4 and 5 years, depending on the length of your undergraduate degree and your master's degree, because master's degree can be 1 or 2 years and undergraduate degrees can be 3 or 4. Does ADH have anything to do with ADHD? It doesn't. That's just a, well, an acronym that happens to coincide. Okay, why aren't secondary sexual characteristics in the specification? They are in the human reproduction side, and unfortunately we don't have time this week to do that. That's kind of the other bit that would need to be done within the hormones section. But this week we just didn't have quite enough sessions, and that tends to come up a couple of times because you kind of touch on it in other parts of the syllabus as well. So we've kept to insulin for this session to give you a really good understanding of how hormones work, using that as a case study. Okay. A few more, loads of questions. This is really good. I don't know whether we're going to have time for quite all of them today. Is biology much more difficult at A-level than GCSE? That's a really interesting question. I think it's just as interesting at both. But at A-level, there just tends to be more detail building on what you learn at GCSE. So you've already got a really good foundation from doing GCSE, and it's just adding more detail onto the top of that. And it's quite good as well, A-level biology, because there's quite a few things in GCSE where you have to just go, this happens, and it just happens, and you have to accept that it just happens. But then in A-level, you start to learn exactly why it happens and why it's a bit more complicated. Okay, really good question that's just said, what about the length of doing undergrad and postgrad in medicine? You are completely right. So medicine degree, it tends to be 5 or 6 years, depending on there are some extensions that you can do and things to a medical degree. So all of that is a little bit flexible when it comes to medical degrees or veterinary degrees in particular in the UK. Okay. A few questions in there. What do sex hormones do? Well, we talked a little bit about what sex hormones do. So testosterone and estrogen are the sex hormones, and estrogen controls the development of female secondary sexual characteristics and is involved in the menstrual cycle. And testosterone controls the development of male secondary sexual characteristics and is involved in sperm production. So those answers are there. Okay, right, let's move on quickly. There will be another question session as well, so sorry if I haven't quite got to them all there. Okay, another slide that's come up a little bit big there. So we are going to talk in much more detail about blood glucose levels and how insulin from the pancreas is involved in that, the hormone insulin that we just talked about. And I've put at the top of this slide homeostasis case study because the hormonal control is kind of a subsection of the homeostasis part of the syllabus in general. So this links in really well. So when we digest a meal, lots of glucose, which comes from carbohydrates, passes into our blood. And from our blood, it gets taken to our body cells, and there it's used for respiration, which provides us with energy. And this is kind of the base of all the things that happen in our body. All the ways that we can move, that we can do things, come from that ability to respire using glucose. But without any control, we wouldn't have very much of the glucose in our blood, because it would just pass straight through. And our cells would be in danger of not being able to respire, and so not being able to create the energy that we need to be able to function as part of our lives. And insulin is the key to this. So insulin is produced by the pancreas, which we saw in our previous slide. And I've got a couple of diagrams here that we've taken to show what happens when insulin and glucose and our body cells all combine. So we've got 6 steps here for what happens. First step is that the pancreas monitors and controls blood glucose concentration. So the pancreas has lots of blood flowing past it, and it knows how much blood glucose is in the blood. When we have a meal, we usually eat some carbohydrates, so our blood glucose rises. And that means that the pancreas detects that change. Remember that diagram that we had right at the start? There's a stimulus, which is that change in blood glucose concentration. The pancreas detects that change and then takes action, and it produces insulin, sends the insulin into the blood. Insulin allows glucose, oh, I've written insulin twice there. Sorry, everyone. That should be glucose. Insulin in the blood allows glucose to move into the body cells to be used in respiration. So insulin is kind of like the key that unlocks the door to those body cells. If insulin's there, then glucose can get out of the blood and pass into our body cells. And then respiration can take place, and we can then move or breathe or do all the things that we need to do. Once glucose gets into our body cells, if it's not needed straight away, it can be stored as insoluble glycogen. This is another word beginning with G. There seem to be lots of those in GCSE biology. And in this topic, we're looking at glucose and glycogen. And we're going to look at another one in a minute. But to start with, we've got glucose, which is a carbohydrate that we take in when we eat. And then glycogen, which is a stored form of glucose in the muscle and liver cells. So we can say, hey, we don't need that glucose now. We're going to stick it all together and put it in the back. And that's what happens in muscle and liver cells. And then if needed, it can be taken out of the back and converted back later. When glycogen stores are full, so when the muscle cell pantry is full of glycogen, any excess glucose is converted to lipids and stored as fats. So if you remember the different molecules that are involved in biology, we have our fats, our carbohydrates, and our sugars. Glucose is a carbohydrate, as is glycogen, which is a stored form of glucose. It's just lots of glucose joined together to make it easier to store. But when we run out of storage space, you can store glucose as a lipid, and lipids are joined together to form fats. So if you regularly consume food that results in fats being stored, i.e. that has lots and lots of glucose and the body doesn't have enough room to store it all as glycogen, so it then converts it to fats, that's when weight is put on and the body runs the risk of obesity if that becomes too much of a problem as such, if you've got lots and lots and lots of glucose being stored as fat. On the left here, we've got this diagram, which is quite a nice flow diagram of what happens. So we've got the pancreas here, insulin is released, glucose is taken in by cells and converted to glycogen in the liver and in muscle cells. That means that blood glucose falls because you've taken that glucose out of the blood to be used. And therefore, the level of glucose in the blood goes back to normal. And this graph is a really good way of demonstrating that level in the blood. So you can see on the y-axis here, the level of glucose in the bloodstream. we eat a meal, it rises above the normal level. And remember, homeostasis is all about bringing things back to normal. So that's what we're looking for here. Insulin's released when glucose rises a certain amount above the normal level. Once the insulin's released, the glucose is removed, it's taken into the body cells or stored as glycogen. And the blood glucose level returns to normal. Everything's happy. So, that is a kind of brief introduction, I suppose, to insulin. You need to know certainly those 6 steps on the slide there for what happens to blood glucose and the glucose from the blood. And you need to know the role of insulin. And that role of insulin is essential for understanding diabetes, which is where we're going to go in a second. But what happens if blood glucose levels go below? We've covered what happens when blood glucose levels rise. But if we're taking in an awful lot of glucose, because we need to do an awful lot of respiring, which might happen if you're doing an awful lot of exercise, something like that, then you need to have a way of getting that blood glucose back up to a normal level. And here we bring in another hormone. So this is our 3rd word that begins with G. We had glucogen, we had glucose, we had glycogen, and now we have glucagon. So, let's continue on this graph for now. So we've had our insulins released. It's all of the blood glucose has gone into our muscle cells, our liver cells, and it's being used, but gone a bit far. Blood glucose has dropped below normal. And that's detected. And then glucagon is released. And glucagon is the signal that those muscle and liver cells need to say, hey, break down that glycogen. It's needed elsewhere. And those cells then break down that glycogen into glucose and send that into the blood to go elsewhere in the body. So that can be summarized in these 4 steps. So 1, when blood glucose falls below the ideal level, the pancreas secretes glucagon, another hormone. So both insulin and glucagon are being secreted from the pancreas. You don't need to remember another gland here. Glucagon makes the liver break down glycogen stores to glucose. So the liver is particularly good at storing that glycogen. It's got a really big pantry. And it can break down lots of that glycogen into glucose, which can then travel in the blood to other places in the body that might need it, i.e. muscle cells that are working really hard. So once that glycogen is broken down, step 3 takes place. Glucose is released back to the blood and taken to cells for respiration. And then 4 there, I've just clarified that using those 2 hormones to create a constant blood glucose level is an example of negative feedback, which we're going to talk about a little bit more tomorrow. But it's basically negative feedback means you're always taking it back to that middle ground. So, for example, in this graph, it would be that long purple line. And here you can see the second half of that diagram that we used on the previous slide for insulin. So glucagon kind of provides the opposite part or the opposite side of that story. So we've got the pancreas, which can release insulin or glucagon. And if it releases insulin, glucose is taken up from the blood, it's converted to glycogen and stored, blood glucose falls, normal level of blood. But if it goes too low, glucagon's then released. Glucagon helps break down that glycogen to glucose, particularly in the liver cells. And it breaks down those amino acids and fats if needed. So if the glucose has been stored as fats, it helps with that too. Blood glucose rises because all of that glucose is traveling from the liver cells into the blood around the body to be used elsewhere, and normal level of blood glucose resumes. So this is our body's way of saying, hey, we'll make sure that we've always got glucose available for you. So when you need energy, we've got it. Okay, this is a really nice slide for summarizing all of that. And I quite like the idea of thinking of our blood glucose level as like a tank in the middle here. So you can put glucose into the tank via glucagon and via our food. That's the top here. And then you can remove it using insulin, which works these taps here at the bottom. So it can be removed to turn into glycogen or converted into fat. And it can be used to supply cellular respiration. And insulin helps the cells take up the glucose to do that. So let's have another set of questions. I'll have a quick look in the chat and the Q&A. What's the difference between glucagon, glucose, and glycogen? Very good. Yes, this is the definite topic for words beginning with G. So they're all in this diagram here, so this is a good place to start. Glucose is here at the top. Let's make the pen red and we can see it. So glucose is here. Glucose is what we get from our food. It's a carbohydrate. And it's basically, it's a very small molecule. And because it's very small, it's very useful because it can move across cell membranes really easily. So we can transport it in our blood and then it can jump over into those cells when needed. Glycogen is the stored form of glucose. And glycogen is basically just lots of glucose all fitted together. And it makes it easier to store. It just fits better in one place. So glycogen is lots of glucose in a form that can be stored. And glucagon is the hormone that triggers that glycogen to be broken down into separate glucose molecules that can then be taken into the blood and used elsewhere. What is an amino acid? That's a protein. So if you think back to your biological molecules, amino acids are what makes up proteins. What causes blood glucose to become too high or too low? So usually it's having a meal. So for example, if you eat lots of cake, you get lots of glucose. And too low would be not eating enough or regularly enough or taking a lot of exercise. So if you're exercising really hard, sometimes your blood glucose levels dip below. What sixth form do I think is best to apply for doing an aeronautical engineering course? Oh, that's a really good question. That's something that your tutor at school would probably be better to answer than I would, because I'm not sure what sixth forms are best for aeronautical engineering, unfortunately. Okay, are the endocrine and the nervous system connected? Yes, in a way they are, because they're both ways of passing messages around the body. So they're kind of connected in that function. And obviously the brain is involved in the control of both of them as well. So they're kind of connected there too, but they run separately. And then what is metabolism? That's a good question. So metabolism is the word that we use to describe the process where our bodies break down the food that we eat and turn that into energy, and then how we use that energy. Okay. Perfect. Okay, let's quickly have a look at diabetes. We're going to look at this in more detail tomorrow. But I thought it would be good today to kind of link this in. A couple of you are already asking questions about adrenaline injections, diabetes, insulin injections, and you're right. So one of the main things that you think of when you think of insulin in GCSE biology is diabetes. So I thought we'd have a look at that very quickly. Diabetes has two types, which quite a lot of you might know. And I thought we'd have a quick look and just learn to tell the difference between them. So in type 1 diabetes, the pancreas doesn't produce insulin, so that hormone is never produced. The blood glucose therefore gets very high after eating because there's no insulin to turn on that tap and say, hey, glucose, get out the blood and get into this body cell. So the blood glucose gets really high, and eventually it's so high that the kidneys start to excrete glucose in urine. And that means that lots of urine is produced because there's lots of glucose to get rid of. The person feels very thirsty because in order to get rid of that glucose, they've had to expel lots of water in the urine too. And they're also quite tired because they're not able to respire as much in their cells. There's no glucose getting into those cells. So the body goes, okay, what glucose have I got stored? Breaks down those fats, breaks down any proteins that are still there. It'll use them if it needs to. Any glycogen stores will go very quickly. And so the person loses weight as well. It starts in young children and teenagers and may be influenced by genetics. So they're not quite sure what triggers type 1 diabetes a lot of the time. But it does tend to start quite young and we think is influenced by genetics. Type 1 is different to type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is where the pancreas still makes insulin, but less than the body needs. And therefore the cells stop responding properly to the little bit of insulin that's produced. So type 2 diabetes is where insulin's there, but the body can't handle it. It doesn't know what to do with it. This tends to start as people get older and is strongly linked to obesity and lack of exercise. And it also has a strong genetic link. So it's one of those cases where there's environmental factors and genetic factors that are corresponding there to contribute to this particular condition. And in countries such as the UK and the USA, type 2 diabetes is becoming more common because obesity is also becoming more common. Because of our diets, really. We tend to have very carbohydrate-rich diets or sugar-rich diets, which also act in a similar way and cause us to put on weight. There's a little diagram at the bottom there, just explaining that type 1 diabetes is when there's no insulin, and type 2 diabetes is when cells don't respond to insulin. So you can see the little yellow insulin there, but the cells aren't responding to it. And therefore, the product of both of these is that the cells aren't getting any glucose, and so respiration can't take place. Okay, quick couple of questions, and then we'll do a little bit of exam technique just for the last 10 minutes or so today. It's been quite heavy today, so they're not too tricky questions. Okay, is type 1 inherited? Yes, we think that it might be influenced by genetics, so yes, it might be passed down. We're not doing a Kahoot today, we will do one on Wednesday. Okay, what is glycogenesis? More words that begin with G. We don't have time to explain them all today, unfortunately. Glycogenesis is the formation of glycogen, but you don't need to know that for today. Good question though, Michelle. It does come up in A-level. What diseases could we have if our insulin level isn't balanced, except for diabetes? Ooh, good question. I'm not actually sure on that. I know that it can contribute to a number of different conditions, but I'm not sure that it's kind of a direct cause of other things. That's a bit out of my realm of expertise, unfortunately, that one. But certainly, if we can't balance our insulin levels, that's when we tend to have problems with weight, with respiring, with doing any regular exercise. Is there a cure for diabetes? Not strictly, but type 2 diabetes in particular, and we're going to talk more about this tomorrow as well, so I'll try not to explain too much now, but type 2 diabetes can be quite well controlled by looking at your diet and exercise, and basically just kind of making sure that you have a healthy lifestyle is a big part of that. And type 1 diabetes tends to be the one that's controlled with injections as well. So again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow, so make sure you tune in tomorrow for more info about that. What do I mean by cells not responding properly to insulin? Again, this is slightly more complicated than Gcse, but basically the body cells don't recognize insulin, so they don't have that complementary shape that the insulin can connect to and then open the door, basically. Does this also come in the non-communicable disease section? Yes, very good. It is mentioned there too. Yeah, medication can help as well. I think we're going to leave just talking about what you can do about diabetes for now, because we are going to talk about that tomorrow. Do you have to take A-level biology to study veterinary? Usually, yes. In very exceptional circumstances, you might not need to, but biology is a core requirement for veterinary at A-level, along with quite a few other things. Best place to study biology as a bachelor's? Oh, that's a very interesting question. So in the UK, there's lots of really good biology courses, and the best thing to do is to have a look at, say, the league tables. You can have a look for biology league tables and see which ones come up highest on there if you want the high-performing universities. But also, if you're interested in a specific kind of part of biology, then you might want to look for universities that offer courses that specify more into biology. My undergraduate degree was a very general biological sciences degree, but I went to Exeter, which allowed me to choose my modules. Didn't have very many compulsory modules, and so I ended up doing more of a zoology degree, to be honest. I didn't do an awful lot of microbiology or plant science, but I did a bit in my first year and my second year, so had quite a well-rounded first degree. But you can do undergraduate degrees in, say, ecology, or you can get specific kind of genetics degrees as well. So it's worth thinking about what you're interested in and picking your uni to suit that. What careers can you get out of a biology degree? That is a big question and a really good one, Dan. Thanks for asking that. You can go into research. That is the kind of main academic route there for biology from university. So you can go on and research certain parts of biology in more detail and perhaps complete a doctorate degree, a PhD. And that can contribute to research in all sorts of different areas. But you can also work in commercial laboratories, in industry. So there are lots and lots of biologists, for example, at the moment who are helping to create COVID vaccines. That would be one option. There are also lots of options for different types of biology. So becoming an ecologist, where you look at developments that are taking place particularly in the UK, and try to offset the loss of biodiversity from those. I work with farmers as a farm conservation advisor for a charity. So that's another route. It's quite niche, that one. You can become a marine biologist as well. So you can be involved in kind of fisheries surveys and things around the UK, or in different research into that. There's all sorts of things that you can do with a biology degree. And it's a great degree because it provides you with lots of core skills that are looked for by lots of general graduate employers. So accounting firms, law firms, a lot of those look for biologists because it contains lots of those core skills too. So yes, lots and lots of different things. Career paths for biology with PE. So that will be more along the kind of physiology side. And again, you know, if you want to do more human biology stuff, there are lots of opportunities there in terms of things like nutrition. Even personal trainers need a certain amount of biological knowledge there. Research, again, for that is another option. And all sorts of careers come out of human biology, which tends to be, you know, if you're looking at PE, that has quite a big human biology element to it there as well. Okay. Just picked my A-levels and chose maths, biology and chemistry. Is that good for veterinary sciences and university? Yes, definitely good. There are only a few universities that do veterinary science in the UK, and you can find them quite easily by Googling. So make sure you do that and have a look at their courses. Off the top of my head, Edinburgh, Bristol, Cambridge, Liverpool, and there's at least 2 others that I can't quite remember that do veterinary. So have a look at those. Oh, one of the universities in London does it as well, but I can't remember which one. Careers for psychology and biology. Oh, there's another level again as well. So for psychology with biology, you can do lots of kind of animal behavior or human behavioral studies as well. A lot of recruiting firms look at psychology kind of side, like when you're hiring people for a job, they'll quite often have people that organize the tests that people to do to see whether they're suitable for a job. That's quite a kind of a job that I never knew existed until I talked to someone about that. So that's often something that you get in big companies, particularly. Okay, let's do some past questions, and then I'll try and come back for any last minute questions at the end. Sorry, I know there's some there that I still haven't quite managed to answer, but hopefully I've got to quite a few. So, in your exams, what will questions about hormones and insulin look like? Well, here is a good start, and it's a bit blurry, so sorry about that, but I will read it out to you. So, let's put the pen up here. When you are looking at a question, my number one thing in an exam when you're rushed is to underline the keywords, because if nothing else, it makes sure that you've read the whole question. And the last thing that you want when you're doing your GCSEs is to let go of some of those easy marks that might well boost you up a level. So make sure that you always read the question, underline the keywords, and know exactly what you're doing before you put those answers down. So blood glucose concentration in humans must be kept between 4.4 and 6.1 millimoles per decimeter cubed. I've underlined that because I think the unit is probably going to be important. 4 students, A, B, C, and D, tested their blood glucose concentration with glucose testing strips. They're looking at their blood glucose concentration. The diagram shows the results of their tests and the key from the test strip bottle. Whenever you have a diagram, always make sure you're really familiar with the units. This applies to graphs as well. Make sure you look at axes, make sure you look at trends. So here we've got these 4 students, and we've got the key. So make sure that you know the units of the key, and make sure that you know the increments as well. So here we're going from 3 to 7, and we've gone up in 1 millimole per decimeter cubed for each colour there. And we've got our 4 students, and we can see that B here has the most, D has the least, and then we've got A and C that are kind of in between. So we've got a good idea of that diagram. Which student, A, B, C, or D, has diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake? Answers in the chat. Which student, A, B, C, or D, has diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake? So using what you've learned today, what do you think? Which student, A, B, C, or D? Lots of answers coming in. Good. Last few guesses, time for a last few. Well done, everyone. Yes, the correct answer is B. And the correct answer is B because it has the highest blood glucose levels. And remember, if you've got diabetes, then you're likely to have very high blood glucose levels because either you're not producing any insulin or your body isn't responding to insulin. So that glucose isn't being taken out into the body cells. And if you've eaten a large piece of cake, that's put lots and lots of glucose into your blood. Cake is really rich in glucose. So the answer to that one is B. Okay, which student, A, B, C, or D, is in most need of eating carbohydrates? Let me flick back. Which student is in most need of eating carbohydrates? A, B, C, or D? Okay, good. Answers in the chat. Well done. Loads of people popping those in. That's fantastic. And the correct answer is D. So this student here has very low blood glucose levels and he needs to have some cake. Or she. Which student, A, B, C, or D, has a healthy blood glucose concentration? Okay, let me switch back. Which student has a healthy blood glucose concentration? Ooh, some differences here. Most people saying C, and C is correct. So they've said at the top of the question here what a healthy blood glucose concentration is, and we can kind of correspond that to here. So we know we're looking at about 5, and C has about 5. So it's probably slightly healthier than A, which is down at the 4 level. So a bit of inference needed for that one. These are all 1-mark questions because you're required for a letter. Got another 1-mark question here. Name the hormone that people with diabetes inject to prevent their blood glucose concentration from becoming too high. We haven't quite covered this yet, but pop the answer in the chat if you know it. Great. Yeah, loads of people saying insulin. Exactly. That is exactly right. Okay. Very quickly, here's an example of a 4-mark question that you might get in an exam. 4-mark questions, you definitely need to underline the keywords and you need to plan your answers a little bit. They're the longer questions. So homeostasis controls the internal conditions of the body. Explain, keyword explain, how blood glucose levels are controlled in the body of someone who does not have diabetes. You get 4 points for this question, which means you need to make 4 points in your answer. And you need to explain, so you need to get into the nitty-gritty of the details behind how blood glucose levels are controlled when someone doesn't have diabetes. And to give you a bit of an idea what that looks like, here is the mark scheme. So you can see you can be quite sequential in your answer here. If blood glucose concentration is too high, insulin is released from the pancreas, therefore glucose is moved into the cells. If it's too low, glucagon is released from the pancreas, and that causes glycogen to be converted to glucose and released into the blood. That's your 4 marks. And that, in essence, is a very simple kind of way of explaining what we've talked about today in terms of blood glucose control. So in 4 marks, you can summarize exactly what we've talked about today there by mentioning those 2 hormones and what they do with respect to blood glucose levels. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because it is now 4 o'clock and you all need to go back to whatever you're doing in your Christmas holidays. Or your winter holidays, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for joining today. This lesson will be recorded, so you will be able to catch up on anything that you haven't quite managed to get through today. And I really hope you'll be able to join us tomorrow to talk more about diabetes and how you might treat that. And then finally on Wednesday, we're going to have a look at plant hormones and then do a bit of a quiz about all 3 sessions using Kahoot. So definitely worth tuning in over the next couple of days. Okay, well, have a great evening, everyone. And thanks very much for joining. Any more questions that you have, we will definitely be doing some more question and answers tomorrow. So I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them today. But thanks very much and have a good evening.